They say a good man's worth is measured by his word and his service. I spent a decade of my life proving both, standing guard on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter, watching the cold Atlantic waves crash against the New Jersey shore. My name is Dustin Shaw, and for 10 years, Seaside Heights was just a postcard I carried in my wallet, a reminder of the quiet seaside town where I was born and, eventually, the place where my own family turned me into a ghost. I was always the quiet one, the middle ground, the necessary evil in the twisted dynamic of the Shaw household. My father, Harold Shaw, was a man whose hands smelled perpetually of salt and diesel from his small boat repair shop down by the docks. He wasn't a giant, but his personality was as imposing as a rogue wave. For Harold, respect wasn't earned, it was demanded, usually backed by the clang of wrenches and a booming voice that always seemed to find fault. I wasn't a natural mechanic like he wanted, so I was immediately labeled the dreamer, the one whose head was always lost in the horizon. Then there was Darlene, my stepmother, a woman whose smile vanished the second the door closed behind a neighbor. She was obsessed with appearances, running a tight ship designed only to project a flawless image to the rest of Seaside Heights. For her, my simple Coast Guard uniform was a source of endless critique. "Dustin, stand up straight. Don't slouch like you're carrying the weight of the world," she'd snap. Never realizing that being in their house was the weight of the world. I was never quite good enough for Harold's approval or Darlene's social ledger. And finally, Seth, my younger half-brother, 4 years my junior, was their golden boy. The center of their universe. Seth was reckless, charmingly irresponsible, and perpetually in debt from one get-rich-quick scheme to the next, usually involving some shady card game or a failed crypto investment. No matter how deep the trouble, Harold and Darlene would rush to shield him, viewing his failures as mere youthful exuberance. My accomplishments, on the other hand, were always treated with suspicion. When I graduated at the top of my class from training, my father only grunted, "Good. Now what's next?" I was the invisible middle child. My childhood was measured by forgotten birthdays and hollow compliments. The only piece of solid ground I ever stood on belonged to my late mother, Clara. She left me a small, 2-bedroom cottage near the water, a quiet place that was meant to be my sanctuary. It was the only part of Seaside Heights that still smelled like her, like sea spray and lavender. But when I chose the service, protecting the border and earning my own stripes, I left the house in my father's care, trusting him to manage it, trusting him with the one thing I treasured. It was a trust that would prove more costly than any war zone I'd ever deployed to. The one true light in the storm of the Shaw family was a woman named Clara Hayes. She wasn't family by blood, but she had been my mother's dearest friend and my quiet guardian angel. Clara Hayes, with her kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, ran a dusty little antiques shop a few blocks from the beach. When I was a boy, and the arguments at home became too much, I would slip away and sit among the old furniture and forgotten treasures in her shop. She taught me about patience, about the history of the waves, and she was the only one who ever truly listened to me. Dustin, not the voice in the uniform, not the shadow in the house. Every time I called home from a distant port, a 5-minute check-in with Harold or Darlene was always a reminder of my invisibility. But a call with Clara Hayes was different. "Dustin, are you safe, my boy? Keep that good heart of yours steady." She would say she was the one person who validated my existence, and it was her image, sitting on a weathered porch, that fueled my service abroad. I saved. I scrimped, pouring every extra dime into my bank account, dreaming of the day I could return, open my own small maritime security consultancy, and finally reclaim my life on the shore. I had saved nearly $80,000, the foundation of my future. But that future was about to be washed away, not by the waves, but by the relentless tide of my own family's self-interest. The hardest part about serving was the loneliness. But coming home, that was the truly terrifying part, because I knew, deep down, that while I was away guarding the shores of this nation, the people I left behind were likely plotting the quickest route to break my heart. I just didn't know how deep the betrayal would go, or that the old house, the only inheritance of love I had, was already gone. The bus pulled into the Seaside Heights terminal, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt the familiar blast of salty air on my face. It should have felt like a homecoming, a moment of pride after years of disciplined service. Instead, a cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The Shaw house, where Harold and Darlene lived, looked the same, with its impeccably trimmed hedges, a tribute to Darlene's obsession with appearances. But the familiar scent of old lavender and sea brine wasn't quite right. I walked the few blocks to the small cottage my mother, Clara, left me. It was the only piece of my childhood that felt real. I had envisioned this return countless times, unlocking the worn wooden door, smelling the familiar dampness, and knowing I was finally home. But when I reached the address, the air drained from my lungs. The cottage wasn't there. In its place stood a bland, newly built duplex, all cheap vinyl siding and 2 bright windows. I stood frozen, the heavy duffel bag sliding from my shoulder and hitting the pavement. It was like finding a ghost where your heart used to be. A quick, frantic search of the property records later that afternoon confirmed the sickening truth. The cottage had been sold 2 years ago. The signatures on the deed belonged to Harold and Darlene. They hadn't just sold it. They hadn't informed me. Their own son, their tenant, the rightful heir. I called my father's repair shop, my voice shaking not with anger, but with disbelief. "Dustin? You're back?" Harold's voice was rough and devoid of warmth. I cut straight to the chase. "The house! Dad, where is Mom's house?" Harold hesitated, the silence on the line stretching into an abyss. "Look, son, it was an old place, falling apart. Darlene and I made a business decision. The market was hot. We liquidated the asset." Liquidated the asset. He spoke of my mother's legacy like spoiled milk. "And the money, Dad? That $80,000 I sent you to save? My life savings, the foundation of my security, the fund I plan to use for my new business." Harold sighed, sounding more annoyed than regretful. "Well, that's gone too. Investment losses. Look, Seth needed some capital for a venture, a major investment opportunity. It failed, but we had to support him. You were overseas. Dustin, what did you need it for?" Darlene grabbed the phone, her voice cold and cutting. "Stop acting like a martyr. Dustin, it was an emergency. Seth is family, and you're a single man who can rebuild your savings. We did what any loving parents would do. You can find another place. Now stop calling here. We have a reputation to maintain." I hung up, staring at the phone, feeling hollowed out. $80,000, my mother's house, my trust, stolen, not by a stranger, but by my own blood, the people who were supposed to be my anchor. I had served my country, and they had looted my future. I was completely bankrupt, and I hadn't even unpacked my bag. Desperate and numb, I wandered down to Clara Hayes's antique shop. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled like vanilla and old linen, and for a fleeting moment, the wound felt less deep. I told her everything. She listened, her eyes welling up with tears, shaking her head at Harold's treachery. "Clara, your mother, she would be heartbroken. Dustin, that cottage was her soul. It was there, sitting among the forgotten treasures, that my life took another seismic shift." A few days later, a stiff, formal letter arrived at the General Post Office box I had set up for my return. It was from a powerful, old money law firm in New York City. I opened it with detached curiosity, assuming it was a scam. The letter explained that I was the sole living heir and beneficiary of the Clara Conservation Trust, named for my mother who died before I could truly know her. My mother, it turned out, hadn't just been a kind woman from Seaside Heights. She had inherited a massive real estate portfolio from her own estranged family and had secretly placed it in a trust fund managed for decades by the New York firm. The current valuation of the trust, designated for marine and historical preservation along the New Jersey coastline, $45 million. I sat in my cheap, temporary motel room, staring at the number, $45 million. My father had stolen my $80,000, and fate had countered with $45 million. It felt like an unbelievable, surreal cosmic joke. I hadn't even been looking for money. I was looking for family, for a home. Now I had enough money to buy Seaside Heights. Yet I had nowhere to turn for a simple conversation. I had become a secret millionaire, but the emptiness in my heart was deeper than ever. This was my hidden inheritance, my life's fortune, and not a single soul, not even Clara Hayes, could know. The discovery of the $45 million inheritance didn't bring the immediate euphoria you see in movies. Instead, it brought a crushing weight of realization. The money was a fortress, but the emotional truth was a wasteland. I had the power to change my life, yet my family's betrayal still burned. They had stolen $80,000 and shattered my trust. And now, I was haunted by the question, if I were truly helpless, if I had nothing, would they have cared? I knew I had to test them. I had to know the full truth of their hearts. I contacted the New York law firm, finalizing the trust's anonymous setup, ensuring my $45 million was untouchable and invisible to the outside world. Then, I drove back toward the Shaw home, the cold sea air a stark contrast to the boiling tension in my chest. I called Harold first. I adopted a strained, weak voice, the voice of a man broken by circumstances. "Dad," I started, trying to sound genuinely desperate. "I need to tell you something. I had a serious accident during my last deployment. It wasn't life-threatening, but it requires immediate surgery, an internal injury. It's $7,000 for the procedure, and to cover my flight back." I waited, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding like a drum against the hull of a ship. The silence on the other end was not one of worry, but of calculation. Then, Harold sighed, his voice flat and annoyed. "Dustin, you're a grown man, a veteran. You should have insurance. $7,000 is nothing to scoff at. I can't just pull that out of the air. Business is slow. And Seth, well, he needs us right now." He shifted the blame immediately, citing Seth's endless financial drama. "You'll figure it out," he concluded, his voice cold, as if dismissing a faulty piece of equipment. "That's what men do." Darlene was worse. When I called her, she barely listened to the description of my injury. "Dustin, please," she said with a tone of utter exhaustion. "Don't make a scene. Your father and I have to present a united front for Seth. His reputation is already suffering because of that loan. You calling, asking for money, it doesn't look good for the family image. We just can't." I hung up, the words ringing in my ears. It doesn't look good for the family image. My health, my safety, my very existence was less important than their superficial reputation or Seth's irresponsibility. The small sliver of hope I had held on to, that maybe their greed had blinded them but hadn't totally hardened them, shattered completely. I was truly utterly on my own. I drove straight to Clara Hayes' antique shop. I couldn't bear to lie to her, but I needed comfort. I told her I had been turned away by Harold and Darlene. I sat on an old velvet armchair, head in my hands. They just didn't care," I whispered. Clara Hayes pulled up a stool, her face lined with sorrow. Not for me, but for her old friends. She knew Harold and Darlene's true colors well. She didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she rose slowly, walked toward a dusty old cabinet behind the counter, and pulled out a worn metal lockbox. Her hands, gnarled and soft from decades of sorting antiques, trembled slightly as she unlocked it. "Dustin, my dear boy," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "Your mother was my best friend, and you are the closest thing I have to a son." She pulled out a stack of neatly folded bills secured with a rubber band. "This is it, my savings," she explained. "For years, I've saved for a new heater, a new roof. It's not the full $7,000, but it's close. $4,500. Take this for now. My dear, we'll find a way for the rest. You need to be well. You need to come home." I stared at the money, the entirety of her meager pension, saved over years from a small antique business. This frail, elderly woman, who had nothing to gain, was offering me her last refuge while my wealthy, able-bodied parents had dismissed me like a beggar. I choked on a sob, the tears finally coming, not for my own pain, but for her impossible, shining love. "Clara Hayes, I can't," I gasped, pushing the money back. "This is your future, your security." She pressed the bills into my hands, her gaze firm. "My future is watching you succeed. Dustin, if I don't help you, what did your mother and I teach you about love? Take it, don't you dare refuse me." I didn't take the money, but I took her love. I embraced her, the scent of vanilla and old paper filling my senses, feeling my heart begin to heal, realizing that the real inheritance wasn't the $45 million. It was this unconditional love. In that moment, I made a silent vow. I would use my power, my fortune, to ensure Clara Hayes' final years were nothing but comfort and peace. And I would honor my mother's legacy, not just with money, but with action. Clara Hayes' unconditional love was the anchor I needed. I didn't take her savings, but the sheer willingness of that sacrifice cemented my purpose. I realized the $45 million wasn't a ticket to escape my past. It was a tool to honor my mother's memory and to repay the debt of kindness I owed to Clara Hayes. My service had been about protecting the coast. Now my fortune would be about healing the community my mother loved. The first step was taking care of Clara Hayes. She lived frugally, constantly patching up her old house and worrying about rising heating costs. I found a beautiful, small, craftsman-style home on the quiet side of Seaside Heights, complete with a sprawling front porch and a hidden garden space. It was perfect. I finalized the purchase anonymously through my lawyer. Then, I drove to her antique shop. "Clara Hayes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've settled my affairs. I'm moving into a new place and I want you to come with me. It's got a huge garden, plenty of light, and you'll never have to worry about the heat again." She looked at me, her eyes wet but shining with concern. "Dustin, I can't be a burden. I'm too old for big changes." I knelt beside her, taking her hands. "You are my family. Clara Hayes, you are never a burden. You're the only person who ever saw me. Let me see you happy." She finally agreed, and watching her face light up as she saw her new home, her new garden, was the first true moment of joy the inheritance had given me. She was safe, and that alone was worth far more than $45 million. Next, I tackled my mother's legacy. My mother, Clara, had been obsessed with the town's historical lighthouse, a tall, stoic sentinel standing guard on the edge of the bay. It had fallen into disrepair, deemed too expensive to fix by the local council. I knew this was where I had to begin. The lighthouse was my mother's soul, and its restoration would be my anonymous act of defiance against Harold and Darlene's petty selfishness. I worked with my New York lawyers to establish the Beacon Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to marine and historical preservation in New Jersey. The foundation was entirely anonymous. No one outside my legal team knew Dustin Shaw was the sole donor. I poured several $1 million into the foundation's initial endowment, earmarking the largest portion for the lighthouse restoration. I quickly found a small, discreet office building on the waterfront. The irony wasn't lost on me. This office was the exact address of the cheap duplex that now stood on the site of my mother's stolen cottage. I leased the space, not just for a location, but as a symbolic act of reclaiming my mother's physical ground from my father's betrayal. The project began quickly. Local contractors were hired. The old lighthouse, battered by decades of storms and neglect, began to show signs of life. New glass was fitted into the lantern room. The historic iron staircase was repaired. The exterior was repainted the original pristine white. I received weekly photo updates from the foundation's project manager. I would sit in my small office, my mother's ghost office, staring at the towering structure in the photographs, feeling a strange, unfamiliar pride. This was my voice, not through a microphone, but through action. I stayed completely out of the public eye. I started my own small consultancy, working with maritime security firms, making just enough to cover my day-to-day expenses. I lived a simple life with Clara Hayes in the new house, eating her homemade clam chowder and listening to her quiet stories. Every morning, I worked on my small contracts. Every afternoon, I secretly managed my millions, turning the pain of my past into a concrete form of hope for my community. The town of Seaside Heights was about to receive a massive gift, and the family who had stolen my $80,000 was about to find out exactly what I was worth. 6 months after the money arrived and the foundation was established, the day of the lighthouse dedication ceremony arrived. The old sentinel, once a symbol of the town's neglect and my mother's fading memory, now stood gleaming white and proud against the azure New Jersey sky. Its new Fresnel lens, installed by my foundation, promised to shine brighter than ever. I drove Clara Hayes to the event. She wore a simple dress and a small, hopeful smile, carrying a picnic basket filled with her famous butter cookies. The atmosphere was electric. Locals had gathered in huge numbers, buzzing with curiosity about the massive, swift restoration project. Everyone knew the lighthouse was saved, but no one knew by whom. We took seats discreetly near the back of the small crowd. I watched Clara Hayes, her eyes fixed on the towering structure, and felt a quiet satisfaction. This was my victory, achieved without shouting or demanding recognition. It was a fulfillment of the promise I made when she offered me her last savings. Then, the air shifted. I saw Harold, Darlene, and Seth arrive, walking past the throng of local well-wishers with an air of self-importance. Harold wore his usual scowl, clearly bothered by the interruption to his workday. Darlene was impeccably dressed, her perfect image firmly in place. Seth, predictably, was scrolling through his phone, looking bored. They spotted me near the back, next to Clara Hayes. Harold didn't smile. He didn't even nod a greeting. He simply gave me a look of cold judgment, the familiar look I'd received all my life. The look that said, "You don't belong here." Darlene, however, approached first, her smile brittle. "Dustin, how surprising to see you. Are you waiting for a handout? The free food is usually after the speeches. Dear." Her tone suggested I was simply there to mooch. Seth, momentarily pulling his eyes from his screen, smirked, still wearing those bargain bin jeans. "Brother, looks like the big maritime consulting gig didn't pan out. Tough break." They didn't ask about my injury. They didn't ask how Clara Hayes was doing. They simply confirmed their belief that I was a failure who had returned home to scavenge. I felt the old pain, sharp and familiar, but this time, it was mixed with the sweet anticipation of the truth about to break over them. Clara Hayes squeezed my hand, her eyes flashing with a protective fire. The ceremony began. The mayor spoke, praising the beauty of the lighthouse and emphasizing its historical importance to Seaside Heights. Then, a representative from the town council stepped up to introduce the primary figure behind the restoration. "We have been blessed," the councilman announced, his voice booming with gratitude. By an anonymous donor, a single individual who, through their incredible generosity and commitment to the Jersey Shore, has ensured this magnificent beacon will shine for another century. That donor created the Beacon Foundation and provided the multi-million-dollar endowment that made this all possible. The crowd erupted in applause. Harold and Darlene clapped politely, still looking around, clearly wondering which wealthy East Coast family had stepped in. The councilman continued. The donor remains fiercely anonymous, but they agreed to send one representative to share a few words. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the acting trustee and the creator of the Beacon Foundation. It was time. I stood up slowly. Clara Hayes looked up, startled. Dustin, where are you going? She whispered. Confused. I gave her a knowing smile, the first truly genuine smile I'd worn since my return. I'm going to finish a conversation. Clara Hayes. A very old conversation. I walked toward the podium, the sounds of the cheering crowd fading into a dull roar. Every eye in the square turned to me, the man they thought was a failed veteran living off scraps. I saw Harold's face first. His jaw went slack, dropping the facade of indifference. Darlene's perfectly constructed smile crumbled into a mask of pure disbelief. Seth finally lowered his phone, his eyes wide, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just teleported from another planet. The air felt thick with sudden, collective realization. The invisible man was walking toward the light. I reached the podium, the silence of the crowd more deafening than the applause. I placed my hands firmly on the microphone stand, looking out over the sea of faces, letting my gaze settle, briefly, on my family. Harold was rigid. Darlene was covering her mouth with a manicured hand, and Seth just stared, his eyes burning with confusion and something primal. Greed. Thank you, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified for the entire town to hear. I am here today not just as the representative of the Beacon Foundation, but as a former resident, someone who grew up just a few blocks from this magnificent structure. I grew up loving this coastline, loving this town. I paused, letting the emotional weight build. My late mother, Clara, taught me that heritage is measured not in dollars, but in the landmarks we preserve. This lighthouse was her favorite place. I looked directly at my father, and the bitterness was sharp and clean. When I returned to Seaside Heights, I found that the people closest to me had stolen my home, stolen my savings, and stolen my trust. They had stripped me bare, leaving me with nothing but the hope taught by the one truly loving soul I knew. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping, yet powerful. I once asked for $7,000, a simple request for help to save myself. Today, through this anonymous gift, I am returning several $1 million to this community to save a piece of our shared history. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd erupted, not just with applause, but with a roar of recognition and admiration. Strangers stood cheering the quiet man who had exposed the hypocrisy of his own life with a single, massive act of benevolence. I finished quickly, stepping down without taking a single question, and made my way back to Clara Hayes. She rose, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of fierce, protective pride. Dustin, she whispered, pulling me into a hug. You are your mother's son. You've made her so proud. I helped Clara Hayes to the car, weaving through the stunned faces. Harold, Darlene, and Seth were frozen in their seats. I didn't acknowledge them, but I knew the confrontation was inevitable. Later that evening, the phone rang relentlessly at the quiet house I shared with Clara Hayes. I ignored Darlene's frantic calls. Finally, Harold's number appeared. I answered. Dustin! What the hell was that? You have $45 million? You made a public spectacle of us! Harold's voice was a low snarl, laced with fear and mounting excitement. I made a public statement of the truth. Dad, I corrected him calmly. Don't be a fool. We're your family. Now we need to talk business. He snapped, the veneer of outrage dropping to reveal pure greed. My shop is failing. You can inject about 2 million, expand it into a regional chain. You have the money. I have the experience. We can be partners. Son. Before I could respond, Darlene snatched the phone. Her voice was suddenly sweet, dripping with forced affection. Oh, Dustin, darling, I'm so proud. But you know, my dream has always been to open a high-end spa, Darlene's Oasis. Just a few $100,000, and I'll pay you back. You owe us, Dustin, for raising you. Seth, yelling in the background, chimed in. Ask him if I can get a new truck, a Ford Raptor. I listened to their demands. No apologies, no concern for my past struggle. Only calculations of how my secret fortune could fix their failures. The test was over, and they had failed spectacularly. My voice was ice. I am not investing in a failing repair shop. Darlene, I am not funding a vanity project. And Seth is not getting a new truck. The money is in a conservation trust, dedicated to preserving this town. I won't use it to fund the very self-interest that almost destroyed me. Harold took the phone back, his voice turning vicious. You ungrateful brat! We raised you! We deserve this! You're selfish! You've turned your back on your family! I hung up. The coldness in my heart solidified. I was done seeking their approval. But they weren't done fighting. The very next day, the local Seaside Heights paper featured a column titled, The Millionaire Who Forgot Family. Harold and Darlene, under a guise of tearful sorrow, had told the reporter that I was a stingy, selfish prodigal son who refused to help his poor, aging parents and struggling brother. They were using my own story against me, twisting the truth to fit their narrative of victimhood and greed. They had chosen public shame and smear tactics over a simple, truthful apology. The newspaper article was a bitter pill, confirming their complete inability to prioritize family over finance. Harold and Darlene painted me as a monster to anyone who would listen, but I refused to respond. I had the truth, and I had Clara Hayes, who read the slanderous article and simply shook her head. They're drowning, Dustin. Greed is a current that pulls them under, she said, her voice filled with pity, not anger. I realized my battle wasn't with them anymore. It was about protecting my own peace. Life with Clara Hayes settled into a rhythm of quiet, genuine affection. We cooked together, watched the sunset over the newly gleaming lighthouse, and talked about everything except money. She was my sanctuary. Meanwhile, the Beacon Foundation grew steadily, quietly funding scholarships for local students pursuing maritime studies and starting a program to restore the historic fishing docks. I was building a legacy of light, while my family continued their path of self-destruction. The inevitable finally happened. The whirlwind that was Seth Shaw began to spin out of control. His reckless lifestyle and bad gambling habits, which Harold had always shielded, had led him to borrow money from the wrong people. Individuals who didn't accept Harold's apologies or Darlene's excuses. One evening, I received a frantic, whispered call from a nervous acquaintance in Seaside Heights. Dustin, you need to know. Your brother Seth is in deep. Real deep. Some loan sharks from Atlantic City are looking for him. Harold tried to cover it, but the debt is huge. Tens of thousands. I felt a cold dread. Not for Seth, but for my father. Harold's health had never been strong, and the stress of trying to manage Seth's mounting debts, coupled with the humiliation from the lighthouse reveal and my refusal to bail them out, was clearly taking its toll. Then, Darlene called, her voice stripped bare of its vanity and pretense, reduced to a trembling, panicked whisper. Dustin, please, listen to me. It's Harold. He collapsed. A massive heart attack. They rushed him to the regional hospital in Toms River. The doctors say it's stress. They need immediate surgery, but we don't have the funds. The insurance won't cover everything. and those vultures are demanding payment. My blood ran cold. Despite the betrayal, despite the public smears, despite the theft, Harold was still my father. I could hate his choices, but I couldn't let him die. The conflict was sharp and immediate. My duty versus my deeply wounded heart. My mind flashed back to their cold refusal of my $7,000 request. Now the cost was 10 times that amount, and they were truly helpless. "I'm on my way," I said, cutting her off, my voice flat. I drove to the Toms River Hospital, the familiar smell of antiseptic and desperation greeting me. I found Darlene and Seth in the waiting room. Darlene was weeping openly, her flawless makeup smeared. Seth looked pale and utterly defeated, his usual arrogant swagger gone. They didn't even notice me at first. They were too busy arguing in hushed, bitter tones about who was to blame for the financial crisis. I bypassed them and found the lead doctor. He confirmed Harold needed an immediate, costly procedure. The payment deadline was tight. "I'll cover the costs," I told the doctor quietly, adding the same condition I applied to my foundation. "I want this to be completely anonymous. Do not tell my family who paid. Not a word." I immediately contacted my lawyer, routing the funds from the Clara Conservation Trust, the money my mother's legacy provided, to cover Harold's entire medical bill and, without hesitation, Seth's crippling gambling debts. It was a single, massive wire transfer that saved my father's life and cleared my brother's slate. It was an act of profound, silent forgiveness. I didn't do it for them to thank me. I didn't do it for them to feel indebted. I did it because, unlike them, I had a choice. I could be motivated by revenge, or I could be motivated by the true, unconditional love I learned from my mother and Clara Hayes. I chose the light. I couldn't save their character, but I could save their lives. I stayed in the hospital waiting room for 2 days, a quiet, invisible presence, while Harold recovered. Darlene and Seth continued to fret and argue about money, completely unaware that the man they had scorned was the one who was silently paying for their very survival. I left before Harold woke up, returning to the sanctuary of my home and the gentle presence of Clara Hayes. Returning to the calm warmth of the house and the steady presence of Clara Hayes was like stepping off a stormy deck and onto solid land. I told her everything about Harold's heart attack and the desperate situation with Seth's debt. I told her how I had secretly paid for everything through the trust, ensuring their survival while keeping my identity hidden from them. Clara Hayes listened, quietly kneading dough for her famous cookies. When I finished, she didn't look proud or judgmental. She looked thoughtful. "You always think of others first, Dustin," she said, gently squeezing my hand. "That's your greatest strength, just like your mother's. But some things, my dear, people need to know. Not for you to gloat, but for them to feel the weight of their choices. They need to understand the depth of the kindness they refuse to show you." A few days later, while I was working in my home office, I heard Clara Hayes on the phone. Her voice, usually soft, carried a firm, unmistakable resolve. She was talking to Darlene. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard key phrases: the hospital bill, paid in full, an anonymous donor. It was Dustin. I was stunned. When she hung up, I walked into the kitchen, a mix of frustration and relief washing over me. Clara Hayes. Why, I didn't want them to know. I wanted the quiet closure. She turned, wiping flour from her hands, her eyes gentle but resolute. They needed to see the light. Dustin. They needed to see how big your heart is, even after they broke it. A secret act of forgiveness heals the giver. But sometimes, revealing it heals the receiver too. They need a chance to regret, truly regret, what they did to their own son. Her action was the final, critical step in my journey. The truth was out, not delivered by me as a weapon, but by the one person whose judgment was pure and unquestionable. A few weeks later, The call I had simultaneously dreaded and waited for arrived. It was Harold. His voice over the phone lacked the truck engine roar I remembered. It was frail, slow, and hesitant. "Dustin," he began, his voice barely a whisper. Can you meet with us? Darlene and Seth want to come too. We need to talk to you." I went silent, gripping the phone tightly. Part of me screamed to refuse, to maintain the safe distance I had built. But then I looked at Clara Hayes tending her lavender garden outside the window, and I heard her wisdom. "Forgiveness sets you free." "Yes, Dad," I replied, taking a deep breath. "I'd like to invite everyone to my home this weekend. My home." The day they arrived felt surreal. Clara Hayes and I prepared a simple seafood stew, the aroma filling the house with a sense of warmth and normalcy that the Shaw family had never known. I stood in the living room, feeling calm. I wasn't the boy waiting for approval. I was the man in control of his own narrative. When the doorbell rang, I opened the door. Harold looked older, his face etched with exhaustion and recent pain. Darlene wore a simple sweater, the picture of perfection finally stripped away by genuine stress. Seth stood beside them, his eyes avoiding mine, holding a small, uncomfortable vase of flowers. "Come in," I said, my voice calm, but my heart ready for anything. They sat around the dining table, quiet and stiff. Dinner began in silence. The only sounds the clinking of spoons and the soft whistle of the wind coming off the bay. I looked at them, the people who had turned their backs when I asked for $7,000, the people I had saved with a single anonymous act. Finally, Harold spoke. His voice trembled slightly. "Dustin, I'm so sorry. For the house, for the money, for the things I said in the paper. I was wrong to call you selfish. I didn't know what you did for me, for Seth, for the town." He bowed his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Darlene reached across the table, tears forming in her eyes. Finally, tears of genuine remorse, not vanity. "I'm sorry too, Dustin. I didn't realize how much we hurt you. We were so caught up in Seth's problems, in our image. We didn't see you. We didn't listen." Seth, for the first time, spoke without mockery. "Dustin, I've been a lousy brother, thank you. For saving Dad, for saving me." I sat there, listening to the words I had craved for 30 years. I didn't know if their apologies were perfect, or completely free of residual self-interest. But I saw a flicker of sincerity, a sign that the pain they had endured had cracked their hardened shells. "Thank you," I said softly. "I don't want to hold grudges. I just want us to move forward." Clara Hayes squeezed my hand under the table, her silent approval more meaningful than any applause. The tension eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. No one mentioned the $45 million. No one mentioned the Beacon Foundation. They simply sat as a family, learning to breathe the same air without resentment. It was a small, imperfect start, but it was a start toward healing. As they left, a sense of quiet closure settled over me. Harold hugged me, his hands no longer gripping my shoulder in a demand for respect, but in a gesture of fragile gratitude. Darlene hugged me longer than she ever had, her eyes showing a genuine, human weariness. Seth, before getting into his father's truck, looked me directly in the eyes for the first time in years and said, "I'm going to find a real job. Dustin, I promise." It wasn't a perfect apology, and I knew the healing would take time, but it was enough. I walked back inside, finding Clara Hayes carefully washing the dinner dishes. I hugged her from behind, inhaling the faint, comforting scent of vanilla and old wood. She had saved me, not from poverty, but from the bitterness that would have poisoned my soul. My story doesn't end with the $45 million. That money changed my circumstances, but the journey changed my heart. My life isn't defined by the times Harold and Darlene turned their backs or the pain I carried from childhood. My story is about the painful rediscovery of self-worth and the transformative power of forgiveness. I learned that a person's value lies not in what they possess, but in the deliberate choices they make. When I won the inheritance, I thought money would force my family to see me, to love me. I was wrong. Money was just a tool, and how I chose to use it, silently, constructively, selflessly, is what defined who I am today. The Beacon Foundation, with its lighthouse restoration and its local scholarships, wasn't just a way to help Seaside Heights. It was my way of healing the wound of invisibility. Every restored plank of wood, every student scholarship funded by my mother's legacy, was a piece of the puzzle that gave my life meaning. But the most profound lesson came from Clara Hayes. She taught me that true love doesn't require conditions or fame. When she was willing to offer me her entire life savings of $4,500, I finally understood. Love is not measured by material value, but by the willingness to sacrifice. She was the guiding light in my darkest days. And through her example, I learned to truly forgive. I didn't forgive Harold, Darlene, or Seth to make them feel better. I forgave them to set myself free, free from resentment, pain, and the loneliness that had once held me captive. I still live in my quiet house in Seaside Heights with Clara Hayes, who now spends her days happily tending to the lavender and telling me stories. Sometimes drifting off mid-sentence, the Beacon Foundation continues to grow, bringing light and opportunity to people I will never meet. My family visits occasionally, and though the path is still fragile, we are learning to be a better version of ourselves, one step at a time. If you are reading this and feeling invisible, please know this: you are not alone. The world may not validate your worth, and sometimes even those closest to you won't see you. But your greatest strength is not the money you earn or the accolades you receive. It is your capacity for empathy and forgiveness. Listen to your heart. Find the people who truly love you, the people like Clara Hayes, and cherish them. Do good, not for the praise, but because it is the most honest way to live. The pain you carry from the past is not a weakness. It is the raw material for your future strength. Face it, forgive it, and let that be the tide that cleanses your soul. Shine your own light. Thank you for listening to my story. If this message resonated with you, I encourage you to share your own thoughts below. Who is your guiding light? Please consider liking and subscribing to our channel to hear more stories about finding hope in the darkest places.